They say silence is a woman's best reply to a fool. But sometimes silence isn't a reply. It's a preparation. A quiet, simmering pot where revenge is the main course, best served when they least expect it. For Elena DeLuca, that silence began on a chilly Tuesday evening in Connecticut, under the soft, unforgiving glow of a crystal chandelier that had cost more than her father's car. The air in the DeLuca dining room was thick with the scent of old money and the sound of muted, polite laughter. It was a world she had married into, but never truly belonged to. Tonight, she had tried to bring a piece of her world to them. On the polished mahogany table, nestled between silver platters of bland, acceptable canapés, sat a large, steaming tureen of cioppino. It was her grandmother's recipe, a rich, fragrant seafood stew that tasted of the San Francisco fog and a love that was loud and warm and unapologetic. Her husband David tapped his wineglass for attention, a smug smile playing on his lips. He took a deliberate spoonful of the stew, swirled it in his mouth with the air of a seasoned critic, and then he chuckled. It was not a kind sound. In front of their friends, their family, he looked at her and said, "Honey, I love you, but this tastes like something a fisherman would throw back into the sea." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the room. It was then that his mother, Isabella, delivered the final blow, her voice as smooth and cold as marble. "It's rustic, dear," she chimed in, a perfectly manicured hand waving dismissively. "Perhaps you should stick to things that don't require heritage." In that moment, something inside Elena broke. Or maybe it was forged. The weight of the silver ladle in her hand felt immense, an anchor pulling her down into a silent, deep ocean of shame. They weren't just insulting her food, they were erasing her story, mocking the memory of the one person who had ever made her feel like she was enough. She looked at her husband's smiling face, at her mother-in-law's condescending gaze, and she felt nothing but ice. Later that night, as David snored beside her, oblivious and content, Elena did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Instead, she stared into the darkness, and for the first time, she saw a path forward. A cold, clear certainty settled in her heart. The simmering pot had just been placed on the fire. They thought they had silenced her. In reality, they had just given her a reason to begin. To understand the cruelty of that Tuesday night, you must first understand the foundation on which it was built. Contempt in a marriage is rarely born from a single, fiery explosion. It is a quiet rust, a slow decay that begins in the foundations, eating away at the structure until the smallest tremor can bring the whole thing down. For Elena and David, the foundations were flawed from the very beginning, for they came from two different Americas, two worlds that orbited the same sun but would never truly touch. Elena's world was carved into the foggy hills of San Francisco, in a small, bustling Italian-American neighborhood where life spilled out onto the streets. Her childhood home was not large, or quiet, or particularly clean. It was, however, profoundly alive. It smelled perpetually of simmering garlic, fresh basil, and her father's cigar smoke. Love, in her family, was a tangible thing. It was a loud argument that ended in a hug, a hand on your shoulder, and most importantly, it was food. Her grandmother, Nonna Maria, was the matriarch of this world, a formidable woman with flour-dusted hands and a belief that a well-made marinara sauce could cure almost anything, from a broken heart to the common cold. Nonna Maria was the keeper of their family's stories, and she did not write them in a book. She wrote them in recipes, passed down through generations. Elena was her most devoted apprentice. From the age of 5, she stood on a stool by her Nana's side, learning not just the ingredients, but the soul behind them. "Food is not just for the belly, tesoro mio," her Nana would say, her voice a warm, melodic hum. "It is memory. It is love you can taste. When you make this pasta, you are having dinner with your great-grandmother who brought this recipe across the ocean. You must respect the story." For Elena, cooking was an act of communion with her past, a way of honoring the strong, resilient women who came before her. Her world was one of passion, of authenticity, where your worth was measured not by your name, but by the integrity of your character and the generosity of your spirit. The DeLuca world, by contrast, was a sprawling estate in Connecticut, a place of profound and chilling silence. It was a world of manicured lawns, inherited wealth, and emotions that were managed, not felt. The DeLuca home was not a home, it was a museum to their own lineage. Heirlooms were not for using, they were for displaying behind velvet ropes. Love was not a feeling, it was a transaction, a series of strategic alliances designed to consolidate power and prestige. And food. Food was performance. Meals were served in a cavernous dining hall where your own breathing sounded too loud. The portions were small, meticulously arranged, and often foreign, chosen not for their flavor, but for their sophistication and the story they allowed the host to tell about their travels or their refined palate. The architect of this world was Isabella DeLuca. She was a woman who had weaponized politeness, who could strip a person of their dignity with a perfectly phrased, backhanded compliment. She saw the world as a strict hierarchy, with the DeLucas perched firmly at the top. Her life's work was to guard that position against any and all contaminants. David was the product of this gilded cage. He was the handsome, charming prince who had never been taught how to be a king. When he first met Elena during a business trip to San Francisco, he was utterly captivated. He saw her passion, her effortless warmth, and mistook it for a charming novelty. To him, her authenticity was an exotic accessory, something that made him seem more interesting, more worldly than his peers. He pursued her with a relentless energy, promising her a life of love and partnership. And Elena, who had never encountered this kind of polished charm, believed him. She fell in love not with his money, but with the man she thought he was, a man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. She was wrong. The marriage began with promise, but the rust started to form almost immediately. It began with small things. Isabella's gentle suggestion that Elena's vibrant, colorful paintings be replaced with more serene and appropriate art. David's habit of helping her by correcting her grammar in front of his friends. The constant, subtle pressure to change her clothes, her accent, her laugh. They didn't want a partner, they wanted a project. They wanted to strip away the San Francisco, the Italian, the working class, and sculpt her into a perfect, silent DeLuca wife. Her attempts to share her world were met with thinly veiled condescension. When she tried to cook the dishes of her childhood, to fill the silent house with the aromas of love she knew, her efforts were treated as embarrassing failures. David, who once claimed to love her realness, slowly began to recoil from it, his mother's voice a constant whisper in his ear. He began to see her not through his own eyes, but through Isabella's. He saw a woman who was too loud, too emotional, too much. The Chiopino incident was not the first cut. It was the culmination of 1,000 smaller ones, 1,000 moments where she was told, in ways both subtle and overt, that she was not good enough. It was simply the first time that instead of bleeding, she began to harden. The silence that followed the dinner party was a new and unfamiliar kind. Before, the DeLuca house had been filled with a polite, empty quiet. Now, it was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket of things unsaid. Elena moved through the halls of her own home like a ghost, her presence barely registering. She had stopped trying to fill the silence, stopped trying to earn her place at the table. Instead, she began to watch. It is a strange and terrible thing to become a stranger in your own life, to look at the man who sleeps beside you and see not a partner, but a subject of observation. She watched the way David angled his phone away from her when a text message arrived. She noticed how his business calls, once taken in the open, were now conducted behind the closed door of his study. His I love yous, once at least tinged with affection, became clipped and automatic, a password he used to end a conversation. She began to understand that the contempt served at the dinner table was not an isolated event, it was a symptom of a much deeper disease. The disease was secrecy. He was hiding something. At first, she thought, with a painful clench in her heart, that it was another woman. But as she watched, she sensed it was something more, or something different. The real tension arose whenever she brought up the topic of their future, of their finances. She had, early in their marriage, signed papers giving David, with his prestigious family background and financial acumen, discretionary control over the trust fund her Nana had left her. It was a substantial amount, the life savings of a woman who worked with her hands for 50 years. Elena had seen it as an act of trust, of partnership. "You handle this world, darling," David had said, patting her hand. "It's what I'm good at." Now, when she asked simple questions about their investments or planning for the future, his answers were vague and dismissive. "It's all taken care of, Elena. Don't worry your pretty little head about it." The condescension was no longer subtle. It was a brick wall he threw up any time she got too close. The catalyst for discovery, as it so often is, was utterly mundane. A letter arrived regarding the annual renewal of their home insurance policy. David was away on one of his increasingly frequent business trips, and the deadline was approaching. With a sigh, Elena went into his home office to find the relevant paperwork. This room was David's sanctuary, a space that always made her feel like an intruder. It was paneled in dark mahogany, lined with leather-bound books that she suspected he had never read. It smelled of his expensive cologne and self-importance. She felt a familiar knot of intimidation as she sat in his oversized leather chair, but the memory of his sneer across the dinner table hardened her resolve. She began to sort through the files in his desk drawer, neatly labeled in a way that was entirely Isabella's influence. Mortgage, taxes, insurance. She pulled out the insurance file, but her fingers brushed against another folder tucked away at the very back, almost hidden from view. It was a sleek, black portfolio, unlike the standard manila folders he used for everything else. It had no label. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through her. It was the primal instinct of an animal sensing a predator. "Don't open it," a voice in her head whispered. "It's his privacy." But another, stronger voice, a voice that sounded remarkably like her Nana's, answered back, "You have a right to the truth." Her hands trembled as she placed the black portfolio on the desk. She opened it. The first page was a welcome letter from a private wealth management firm in the Cayman Islands, a name she had never heard him mention. It was addressed only to Mr. David DeLuca. The word Mr. felt like a slap. Not Mr. and Mrs.'s. The letter congratulated him on opening his personal wealth account. The word personal echoed in the silent room. She turned the page, and her breath caught in her throat. Before her lay a bank statement, a cold, impersonal grid of numbers and dates. Her eyes scanned the page, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The account had been opened in May of 2018, just 4 months after their wedding. Then, her gaze fell on the column marked Credits. There were entries for every month, without fail. The description was sterile. Incoming wire transfer. But the amount was always the same, a large 5-figure sum. Her heart began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She didn't recognize the source account number at first, but then her eyes locked on the last 4 digits. They were as familiar to her as her own reflection. It was the account number for her grandmother's trust. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt the blood drain from her face as she frantically flipped through the pages. Page after page, statement after statement, told the same horrifying story. For years, every single month, David had been methodically siphoning money, her grandmother's legacy, into his own secret offshore account. The money that was supposed to be their future, the nest egg her Nana had sacrificed for, was being stolen. It was a systematic, calculated, and utterly devastating betrayal. The room began to spin. She gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, the polished wood cold against her knuckles. It all became sickeningly clear. His expensive suits, the limited edition watches, the lavish trips he took without her. She had naively assumed it was DeLuca family money, a world of wealth she didn't understand. But it wasn't. It was her Nana's hard-earned cash. He was using her inheritance to fund a life he pretended was his by birthright. He was literally consuming her past to build his fraudulent present. The humiliation of that dinner party was nothing compared to this. He hadn't just mocked her heritage, he had commodified it, stolen it, and used it as his personal slush fund. She now understood that he had seen her as the perfect mark, a simple, trusting woman with a surprising amount of money, and not enough sophistication to know what was being done to her. In the chilling silence of his office, surrounded by the trappings of a life built on lies, the first crack in their marriage became a chasm. The shock was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. The man she had married did not exist. In his place was a thief wearing her husband's face. A person can only endure the shock of one great betrayal at a time. For Elena, the revelation of the financial fraud was a seismic event, a catastrophic earthquake that leveled the entire landscape of her marriage. She sat in the silence of her husband's office for what felt like an eternity. The incriminating bank statements spread before her like the wreckage of a life she once thought was hers. But after the initial tremor, a strange and chilling calm descended upon her. The grief was still there, a massive, unmovable weight in her chest, but it was now encased in a thick layer of ice. This was no longer a time for tears. This was a time for clarity. With methodical precision, she took out her phone and began to photograph every single page, her hand steady, her focus absolute. Each click of the camera was a quiet declaration of war. She knew what he had done, but she was no longer satisfied with just knowing. She needed to understand the full scope of his empire of lies. The money had been stolen, but where had it gone? Late that night, with David's rhythmic snores echoing from the bedroom, Elena sat at her own small desk, her laptop casting a pale, clinical glow on her face. She began her descent into the second layer of his deceit, moving her focus from the credits to the debits. She started a spreadsheet, a cold and logical grid, to map out the geography of her husband's betrayal. At first, the expenses were predictable, if infuriating. Purchases from Savile Row tailors, membership fees for an exclusive golf and country club, payments to a dealership that specialized in vintage sports cars. She saw it all laid bare. He was using her Nana's life savings to cosplay as a man of immense, independent wealth. He was performing a role, and she was the unwitting and unwilling financier. The anger burned, a low, steady flame. But it was a familiar anger, the same anger she felt when he belittled her cooking. It was the anger of being deemed not enough. Then, she began to notice the anomalies, the charges that didn't fit the script. There was a recurring monthly payment to a high-end floral service in the city, but she hadn't received flowers from him in years. There were charges from a lingerie boutique that sold delicate, expensive things she would never wear. And then there were the hotels. Not in other cities, where he supposedly traveled for business, but right here. A $5,000 charge for a weekend suite at the Carlyle, dated to a weekend he had supposedly been at a leadership conference in Chicago. A pattern of smaller charges at intimate, boutique hotels, dotted across the state. These weren't business expenses. This was something else. This was a secret life, running in parallel to their own. Her heart, which she thought had been shattered already, began to crack in new and excruciating ways. The key that unlocked the final, most painful secret was a single transaction from the previous April. It was a charge for over $20,000 at Cartier, the renowned jewelry store. The date was April 17th, the day after their wedding anniversary. She remembered their anniversary dinner clearly. He had taken her to a modest restaurant, citing the need to be financially prudent. He had given her a small, tasteful pair of earrings that, she now realized with a sickening lurch, he had probably bought at a department store. He had squeezed her hand and told her that their love was more valuable than any material possession. And the very next day, he had walked into Cartier and spent a small fortune. A cold dread washed over her as she opened a web browser and searched for the Cartier website. Her hands shook as she navigated to their collection of necklaces. And there it was, a delicate, platinum chain with a cascading waterfall of diamonds. The Pluie de Diamants necklace. The price listed was exactly the amount on the statement. She had never seen it before in her life. Who was it for? The question consumed her. This wasn't a casual affair. This was a grand gesture, a statement. Fueled by a desperate, morbid need to know, she began to do something she had never done before. She began to stalk his social circle online. She searched for photos from gallery openings, charity galas, and society events that took place in the weeks following the purchase. She scrolled through dozens of images of smiling, impeccably dressed women, her eyes scanning their necks, looking for the telltale sparkle of the diamond waterfall. And then she found it. The photo was from a benefit at the Museum of Modern Art. A woman stood beside Isabella De Luca, laughing, her head tilted back in a gesture of effortless elegance. And there, against her skin, was the necklace. The woman was Claire Vanderbilt, an acclaimed art critic, a woman who was sleek, sharp, and born into the same world as the De Lucas. A woman who had been to their home for dinner on multiple occasions, who had smiled at Elena and complimented her on the very dress she was wearing, while a $20,000 secret, bought with Elena's own money, lay against her collarbone. The screen blurred. This was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just that he was a thief. It wasn't just that he was an adulterer. He was both. And he had woven the two betrayals together into a single, monstrous tapestry of disrespect. He had taken the purest thing in Elena's life, the unconditional, hard-earned love of her grandmother, transformed into a financial legacy, and he had used it to woo a woman who was the living embodiment of everything the De Lucas felt Elena was not. He was erasing her, replacing her, and forcing her to pay for her own extinction. The puzzle was complete. The money, the lies, the affair, it was all one story, a story in which she was not the wife, but the fool. And as Elena sat there in the dark, the cold light of the laptop illuminating the tearless tracks on her face, the victim inside her died, and the strategist was born. Any other woman might have confronted him. There would have been a storm of tears, a tempest of accusations, a dramatic, shattering explosion of grief and rage that would have echoed through the cold, silent halls of the De Luca estate. But Elena was not any other woman. Not anymore. The girl who had cried over a slight at the dinner table was gone, burned away by the white-hot revelations in her husband's office. She understood now that a storm would be a gift to them. It would allow David to lie, to gaslight her, to play the victim. It would give Isabella the satisfaction of seeing her as the hysterical, emotional creature she always believed her to be. An emotional confrontation was their territory, a game they had perfected. To win, Elena knew she could not play their game. She had to create her own. So she chose the most powerful and unnerving weapon in her arsenal: silence. The next morning, she woke before David. She showered, dressed, and went downstairs to make coffee. When he entered the kitchen, looking wary and expecting the continuation of some unspoken conflict, she simply smiled. It was a calm, serene smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice even and light. "Did you sleep well?" The change was so complete, so disarming, that he was visibly confused. He searched her face for a sign of a trap, but found only placid obedience. Over the next few days, Elena transformed into the wife they had always wanted. She stopped trying to inject her own personality into their lives. She cooked the food they preferred. Simple, bland, elegant dishes that required precision but no soul. She listened attentively when Isabella spoke of her garden club. She nodded and agreed when David pontificated on politics. She became a ghost in her own life, a beautiful, compliant ornament, and her silence was profoundly misinterpreted. To David and Isabella, it was the silence of surrender. They believed their campaign of subtle psychological warfare had finally worked. They thought they had broken her spirit, sanded away her rough edges, and molded her into one of them. They would pat her hand, compliment her on finally learning, and exchange self-congratulatory glances over her head. They were fools. They mistook the quiet of a predator in waiting for the stillness of prey. While her days were a performance of domestic tranquility, her secret hours were a meticulous campaign of espionage. Her life now had a singular, driving purpose: the gathering of evidence. The moment David's car left the driveway for work, Elena's war began. His office was no longer a forbidden sanctuary. It was her intelligence headquarters. She had purchased a high-speed document scanner and an encrypted external hard drive. With the cold precision of a forensic accountant, she began to digitize everything. every bank statement from the hidden account, every investment portfolio, every property deed and tax return. She created a labyrinth of files and folders on the hard drive, a perfect mirror of their financial lives, but one that she now controlled. She delved into the digital world, teaching herself how to uncover the digital footprints he thought he had erased. She found the archived travel itineraries for trips he had taken with Claire, booked through a private email account. She found the receipts for gifts, the online reservations for romantic dinners. Each discovery was a fresh stab of pain, a visceral reminder of the depth of his betrayal. There were moments when she would have to retreat to the bathroom, gripping the cold marble sink, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as the sheer cruelty of it all threatened to overwhelm her. But she would not allow herself to shatter. She would look at her reflection in the mirror, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a cold fire, and she would channel the pain. It was no longer just grief. It was fuel. She knew she couldn't do it alone. Navigating the legal world of the wealthy was a game with its own complex rules, and she needed a master player on her side. She spent a week researching, not just looking for a good divorce lawyer, but for a killer. Her search led her to a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in legal circles: Evelyn Reed. Miss Reed was a legendary attorney known for dismantling the financial empires of arrogant men. Elena made an appointment under a false name. She walked into the plush, intimidating law office, not as a weeping victim, but as a client with a case. She wore a simple, elegant dress, a costume from her DeLuca life, and carried a single, slim briefcase. Across a vast mahogany desk, she met the cool, analytical gaze of Evelyn Reed. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Smith?" the lawyer asked, her tone professional but weary. Without a word, Elena opened her briefcase, took out the encrypted hard drive, and connected it to a guest monitor. She navigated to the master file she had created, a file titled Project Nightingale. On the screen, a web of interconnected documents, spreadsheets, and timelines appeared. "My real name is Elena DeLuca," she said, her voice steady. "And this is how my husband, David DeLuca, has been systematically defrauding me for the past 7 years, while using my inheritance to fund his affair." For the next hour, she presented her findings with the dispassionate clarity of a prosecutor. When she finished, Evelyn Reed was leaning forward, her earlier weariness replaced by a sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes. She looked at Elena with newfound respect. "Mrs. DeLuca," she said, a thin, dangerous smile forming on her lips. "Your husband has made the classic, fatal mistake of a narcissist. He didn't just underestimate you. He never even saw you." Elena walked out of that office into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. But for the first time in years, she felt powerful. The plan was in motion. The pieces were being moved into place. That evening, she served David and Isabella a perfectly roasted, perfectly flavorless chicken. David praised it, saying it was the best she had ever made. Isabella nodded in agreement. They ate and drank, content in their victory, completely unaware that they were having dinner with their executioner. They saw her placid smile and believed it was for them. They had no idea it was for the storm that she was about to unleash upon their perfect, fragile world. The legal strategy was a cold comfort. In the weeks following her meeting with Evelyn Reed, Elena felt a sense of detached purpose. The plan was a brilliant piece of legal machinery designed to systematically dismantle David's financial world, seize her stolen assets, and leave him exposed. It was a necessary and just course of action, but it felt sterile, an exchange of papers and numbers in a world of boardrooms and courtrooms. It was a victory, but it was a victory on their terms, played by their rules. It would punish his greed, but it would never touch his arrogance. It would not address the deeper wound, the relentless, soul-crushing assertion that her heritage, her very essence, was worthless. She didn't just want her money back. She wanted them to understand, in their bones, the value of what they had so carelessly mocked. The final push from the world of quiet legal maneuvering into open, personal warfare came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Isabella had decided, in her infinite and unsolicited wisdom, that the house needed to be streamlined. While Elena was out for a supposed spa day, a cover for a 4-hour strategy session with Evelyn Isabella had taken it upon herself to direct a team of professional organizers to help Elena declutter her personal spaces, namely the boxes she kept in the attic. When Elena returned, she found 3 large cardboard boxes by the back door, marked for donation. Peeking out from the top of the first box was a corner of familiar, worn dark wood. Her blood ran cold. She tore the box open, her hands shaking. There, lying on a pile of her old college textbooks and sweaters, was her Nana Maria's recipe box. It was not the leather-bound book, but the physical, hand-carved cherrywood box that had sat on her grandmother's kitchen counter for 60 years. It was dented and scarred, stained with the ghosts of ingredients long since used. It was, to Elena, as sacred as any religious artifact. Beneath it were her mother's wedding veil and a stack of faded photographs of her family. All of it deemed clutter. She picked up the box and walked into the living room, where Isabella was admiring the new, empty spaces. Elena didn't raise her voice. She simply held up the box. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Isabella glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive wave. "Darling, you can't possibly want to keep that splintery old thing. It smells of garlic. We're creating a clean, modern aesthetic. I'm helping you edit your life, to elevate it." To edit her life. The phrase hung in the air, a perfect summation of their entire relationship. They wanted to edit out her past, her family, her soul, until nothing was left but a polished, empty shell. That was the moment Elena knew. A lawsuit was not enough. She had to build something they could not edit, could not dismiss, and could not ignore. That night, she didn't sleep. She retreated to her room, clutching the wooden box, feeling the profound, crushing weight of her isolation. The legal plan felt a million miles away. She was an enemy combatant, living deep behind enemy lines, with no allies, no comfort, only the cold fire of her own resolve. The fight felt immense, and for a moment, she felt small and weak, a scared little girl who desperately missed her grandmother. It was in this moment of deepest despair that she finally opened the recipe box. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed index cards, was the book. It was a simple leather-bound journal, its cover softened to the texture of silk from decades of use. She opened it, and the scent of vanilla, oregano, and old paper filled the air. It was the smell of her Nana's kitchen, the smell of safety, the smell of home. She began to read, not for recipes, but for the notes her Nonna had scribbled in the margins in her elegant, looping script, a mix of Italian and English. These notes were the true legacy. On the page for the Cioppino, stained with a faint red ring from a wine glass, Nonna had written, "Your Nonno, he ate 3 bowls of this the night he asked me to marry him. He said it was the taste of the sea, and a real man is not afraid of the taste of the sea." A sharp, painful contrast to the man who called it fish bait. Beside the recipe for her peasant bread, which required 2 days of patient rising, she had written, "Never rush the dough, tesoro. Good things take time. You give it patience, it gives you life." Elena felt a tear slide down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of recognition. On the page for a simple tomato sauce, a recipe with only 5 ingredients, the note was a defiant manifesto. "They say this is poor people's food. I say we are rich in flavor, rich in love. That is the only wealth that matters." As she read late into the night, Elena felt a profound shift happening within her. This book was not a collection of instructions. It was a testament to survival. It was the story of how a woman with nothing but her hands and her heart had built a life, had nourished a family, had created beauty and joy out of the simplest, most honest ingredients. It was a book about turning flour and water into life, about turning struggle into strength. Her Nana's voice was clear, speaking to her across the years, giving her one final lesson. Do not fight them in their world of paper and numbers. Show them what real value is. Build something from the heart. That is a fortress they can never tear down. The idea, when it came, felt less like a thought and more like a calling. It was a bolt of lightning that illuminated the entire landscape of her future. Her revenge could not be a private legal victory. It had to be a public, undeniable sensory experience. She would build a temple to everything they despised. She would open a restaurant. The vision flooded her mind, fully formed. It would be the absolute antithesis of the DeLuca dining room. Not cold and silent, but warm, loud, and alive. A place with a big open kitchen filled with the sounds of clattering pans and laughter. A place where the tables were made of reclaimed wood, not polished mahogany, and the focus was on the food on the plate, not the name on the guest list. A place where authenticity was the most valuable ingredient. And she knew what she would call it. She thought of the fire her Nana tended in her kitchen, the center of their home. She thought of the cold, decorative, unused fireplaces in the DeLuca mansion. She would call it the hearth, a place of warmth, of community, of creation, the heart of the home. A fire had been lit inside her, one that had been dormant for too long. Evelyn Reed would attack their finances, bleeding them dry in the courts. And Elena would build an empire out of flour and memories and love. She would create a success so profound, so authentic, that it would turn their world of shallow, inherited prestige to ash. The decision, once made, created its own ferocious momentum. The very next day, Elena sat across from Evelyn Reed, not in the lawyer's formal office, but in a discreet coffee shop miles from her Connecticut prison. The first step was to secure her war chest. With Evelyn's guidance, Elena executed a series of swift, legally sound maneuvers. She established a corporation, a shell company with an innocuous name that held no connection to her. Then, through a series of transfers that were both complex and perfectly legal, she liquidated the remaining assets in her Nana's trust, moving the entire sum into the new corporate account. Evelyn had timed it perfectly, just after a quarterly statement had been issued to David, buying them nearly 3 months before he would even notice the change. The moment the final transfer was confirmed, Elena felt a dizzying mix of terror and liberation. The last financial cord connecting her to David DeLuca was severed. The money was no longer a stolen inheritance or a marital asset. It was a weapon, and it was hers alone. The safety net was gone. For the first time in her life, she was entirely on her own, and the feeling was breathtaking. Her next task was to find a battlefield. She didn't want a pristine new construction in a fashionable neighborhood. That was the DeLuca way, buying prestige. Elena needed to build it. She wanted a place with a history, with a soul. For weeks, she scoured the city and its surrounding towns, a real estate agent showing her one sterile, white box commercial space after another. Each one felt like a betrayal of her vision, a soulless container for what needed to be a living, breathing entity. Discouraged and frustrated, she was driving through a forgotten industrial quarter of a nearby city, a place of old brick warehouses and cobblestone streets, when she saw it. It was a squat, 2-story building of dark red brick, its windows boarded over, a faded for lease sign hanging crookedly from a rusted chain. It had been a metalworking forge a century ago, the agent told her, abandoned for decades. It was a wreck. But something called to her. When the agent finally unlocked the heavy wooden door, the air that greeted them was thick with the smell of dust and decay. But as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, Elena saw not what was, but what could be. The ceilings were high, supported by massive, exposed timber beams. The brick walls were rough and imperfect, each one telling a story. And then she saw it. Against the back wall, dominating the entire space, was a colossal stone fireplace, a hearth built not for cozy nights, but for the roaring fires of a forge. It was blackened with a century of soot, its mantle cracked, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was the heart of the building, a place of intense, fiery creation that had long gone cold. In that moment, the name of her restaurant became a certainty, a truth that settled deep in her bones. This was it. This was the hearth. The months that followed were a crucible. Elena threw herself into the resurrection of the old forge with a singular, consuming passion. This was not a project she managed from afar by writing checks. She was there from sunrise to long past sunset, her designer clothes replaced by paint-splattered jeans and steel-toed boots. She was covered in a perpetual layer of dust as she learned the difference between load-bearing walls and cosmetic ones. She argued with plumbers, electricians, and contractors, her initial politeness hardening into the firm, unyielding will of a commander. There were moments of sheer, back-breaking labor, where she worked alongside the crew, sanding reclaimed wood for the tables until her hands were raw, scrubbing the ancient soot from the stones of the hearth herself, as if she were physically scouring away the grime of her own past. The physical exhaustion was immense, but it was a clean pain, an honest fatigue that felt more real than anything she had experienced in her years as a DeLuca wife. Her nights were dedicated to the soul of the hearth, the menu. In a small, cramped apartment she had rented under her corporate name, she turned the tiny kitchen into a laboratory. Her Nana's book was her Bible, but she was not merely a disciple. She was an interpreter, a reinventor. She deconstructed every recipe, respecting its history while infusing it with her own story of pain and resilience. The cioppino became her obsession. She spent weeks perfecting the broth, simmering it for hours, layering flavors of tomato, saffron, and wine until it was a deep, complex symphony of the sea. She built relationships with local fishermen, sourcing seafood so fresh it tasted of the salt and spray of the morning's tide. This dish, the one he had called garbage, would become her masterpiece. It would be an undeniable, irrefutable testament to the heritage he had mocked. There were moments when she nearly broke. A crucial shipment of kitchen equipment was lost at sea. A plumbing issue revealed a catastrophic problem that ate a massive, unplanned hole in her budget. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant ache in her chest. Some nights, she would sit on the dusty floor of the construction site, overwhelmed by the enormity of her task, and wonder if she was insane. But then, she would close her eyes and see Isabella's dismissive wave, or hear David's cruel, careless laughter, and the fire would roar back to life. The day the budget crisis hit its peak, she made a panicked call to Evelyn Reed, confessing she was on the verge of compromising her vision. The next day, Evelyn called back. "I have a proposition," the lawyer said. "An old client of mine, an angel investor, who is profoundly moved by your story and the integrity of your business plan, would like to make a contribution. A significant one. The only condition is that he remains completely and utterly anonymous." Elena was hesitant to take on a partner, but she knew it was a lifeline. She agreed. With the final injection of funds, the last pieces fell into place. On a cool evening, a week before the soft opening, the work was finally done. Elena stood alone in the center of the hearth. The air smelled of beeswax and lemon oil. The wooden tables gleamed under the soft, warm light. And in the great stone fireplace, a fire crackled and danced, casting a lively golden glow across the room. The silence was no longer empty or oppressive. It was the quiet of a stage waiting for the play to begin. She had walked through the fire of her past and emerged, not scorched, but forged. From the ashes of her old life, she had built this, something real, something true, something that was entirely hers. The hearth did not open with a bang. There was no grand opening gala, no red carpet, no press release sent to the society pages. Such things belonged to the world of the DeLucas, a world of performance and empty spectacle. Elena's new world was one of substance. On the first night of service, she simply unlocked the heavy wooden doors and lit the fire in the great stone hearth. Her victory would not be announced. It would be earned, one customer at a time. The first to trickle in were not the city's elite, but the curious residents of the newly revitalized neighborhood. A young couple celebrating an anniversary, two elderly women who had lived on the street for 50 years and remembered when the building was a working forge, a young artist who lived in a loft upstairs. They were drawn in by the warm glow from the windows and the tantalizing, unfamiliar smells wafting into the street. Elena did not work the front of the house. She was not the smiling, sociable host. She was in the kitchen, a space she commanded with a quiet, focused intensity. Dressed in simple chef's whites, a stark contrast to the designer dresses David had forced upon her, she felt more herself than she had in a decade. Every plate that left her kitchen was a prayer, a piece of her story. Through the narrow pass, She watched not for compliments, but for the quiet moments of truth. The look on the young man's face as he tasted her hand-made pasta, the way the elderly woman closed her eyes as she savored a spoonful of soup that reminded her of a time long past. These were her victories. For the first few weeks, success was a slow, rising tide. It was not a flood, but a steady, inexorable creep. The young couple came back, this time with their parents. The artist became a regular, sketching in a notebook at his corner table. The whispers began. People didn't talk about the decor or the exclusive clientele. They talked about the bread. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the warm, crusty loaves that arrived at each table, served not with butter, but with a small bowl of golden green olive oil from a single, specific grove in Sicily, a connection her nonna had established 60 years ago. They talked about the simplicity of it all, how a dish of pasta with nothing but garlic, oil, and chili flakes could be so profound. In a world saturated with culinary theatrics, with foams and gels and deconstructions, Elena's brutal honesty was the most shocking ingredient of all. She was not selling innovation, she was selling truth. The spark that lit the fuse was a visit from a young, unknown food blogger named Anna. She ran a small, passionate blog called Hidden Feasts, dedicated to discovering unsung culinary heroes. She arrived on a rainy Tuesday night, taking a small table near the fire, and she ordered humbly. But the meal she was served was a quiet revelation. She wrote about it later that night, her words not a review, but a testimony. "I came to the hearth expecting a meal," she wrote, "and I left with something that felt like a memory I hadn't yet made." The chef, who remains unseen, is not a cook. She is a conduit for something ancient and true. And then there is the ciopino. To call it a seafood stew is an act of profound understatement. It is the history of the sea in a bowl, a broth so deep and complex that it tastes of distant shores and stories passed down from one generation to the next. The Hearth is not the city's fanciest new restaurant. It is, however, its most important. The blog post, shared among a small but dedicated community of food lovers, found its way onto the screen of Julian Croft. Croft was the chief restaurant critic for the New York Standard, a man whose palate was as refined as his prose was merciless. He was a kingmaker and a dream killer, a cynical veteran who believed he had seen and tasted everything. Intrigued by the blogger's passionate sincerity, he decided to make the trip himself. He arrived a week later, unannounced, booking a table for two, under a false name. A wave of panic rippled through the front-of-house staff as they recognized him. But in the kitchen, Elena was calm. "He eats what everyone else eats," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The food is the same for him as it is for the couple at table 5. No special treatment. The work stands on its own." The kitchen moved with the silent, focused grace of a ballet. Elena inspected every dish that went to Croft's table herself. The bread, the pasta, and finally, the ciopino. She ladled the rich, fragrant broth over the perfectly cooked mussels, clams, and prawns, and for a moment she saw not a critic's table, but her husband's sneering face. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and sent the bowl out. The wait for the review was agonizing. Then, the following Tuesday, it was published. The headline was a cannon blast, "A ghost in a forge. The unexpected, undeniable, best new restaurant in America." Croft's review was not a recommendation, it was a surrender. "I came to the Hearth expecting to debunk a charming little fairy tale," he wrote. "I left feeling like I had been to church." The mysterious chef Elena, who remains resolutely in her kitchen, is a culinary artist of the highest and most honest order. She is not inventing, she is remembering, channeling a kind of soulful, powerful cooking that we thought was lost to time. Her food is an act of defiance against the pretension and soullessness of modern dining. The ciopino is, without exaggeration, a masterpiece, a dish so perfect it silences the table and forces a moment of genuine contemplation. I don't know who this chef is, or what sorrows or joys led her to this kitchen, but she is, right now, the most vital voice in American cuisine. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The restaurant's phone began to ring and did not stop for 3 days. The online reservation system crashed. The whispers of success had become a roar. The hearth was no longer a hidden gem. It was a national destination. The reservation book was filled for the next 18 months. Elena's name was on the lips of every food lover in the country. She had wanted to build something they could not ignore. Now, she had built a fortress of such acclaim, such unimpeachable credibility, that it was impenetrable. She was no longer Elena DeLuca, the inadequate wife. She was Chef Elena, the ghost, the artist, and from the safety of her fortress, she was finally ready to summon her enemies to her door. In the gilded cages of Connecticut's elite, social currency is a fragile and fickle thing. It is built not on wealth alone, but on access, on exclusivity. And in the months following Julian Croft's bombshell review, no commodity was more valuable, no status symbol more potent than a reservation at the hearth. The name began as a whisper at Isabella DeLuca's bridge games and charity luncheons. At first, she dismissed it with the casual arrogance of a woman who believed she was the sole arbiter of taste. The hearth? She'd muse, a perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised in disdain. Oh, you mean that little place in the old factory district? How very bohemian. I'm sure the novelty will wear off. But the whispers grew into a roar that she could not ignore. Her chief social rival, a woman named Beatrice Winthrop, spoke of it with breathless reverence. We had to call in a favor with the governor's office to get a table, Beatrice announced at a polo match, her voice carrying across the lawn. And even then, we waited 6 months. The food. It's not a meal, it's an epiphany. The Julian Croft review was the final confirmation. It was no longer a trendy little secret, it was a national landmark. And for Isabella, this was an intolerable state of affairs. How could a cultural institution of this magnitude exist without her knowledge, without her sanction? Her dismissiveness curdled into a simmering, obsessive need to conquer it. To dine at the hearth was no longer a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of maintaining her position at the apex of the social pyramid. She began her campaign with the supreme confidence of a woman who had never been told no in her life. She sat at her antique mahogany desk and placed a call herself, a rare occurrence reserved for matters of great importance. "Yes, I'd like a reservation for 4, she announced to the voice on the other end. "The name is Isabella DeLuca." She said her name slowly, as if bestowing a great gift. The polite, unshakable response was a profound shock. "I'm sorry, Mrs. DeLuca, but we are fully committed for the foreseeable future. There is a waiting list, but it is currently closed." Isabella was speechless. She assumed it was a mistake, an impertinent new hire who didn't understand how the world worked. She called back the next day, this time dropping the names of senators and CEOs. "Perhaps you could check again," she suggested, her voice dripping with icy condescension. The response was the same, a cheerful, impenetrable wall of politeness. "Our reservation policy is the same for all our guests, madam." Her failure became a quiet, delicious source of gossip. At a cocktail party, Beatrice cornered her. "Isabella, darling, you must tell me what you thought of the hearth. Did you try the cioppino? Simply divine." Trapped, Isabella lied through her perfectly whitened teeth. "Of course," she scoffed. "We're going next week. The chef is a dear, dear friend. She's been begging us to come for months, but our schedule has just been impossible." It was a foolish, desperate lie, and she knew it. The clock was now ticking. She had to get into that restaurant, or her carefully constructed world of social dominance would begin to crack. David, meanwhile, was fighting a much more desperate battle. The river of money from Elena's trust had dried up without warning. His lavish lifestyle, which he had long since come to view as his birthright, was suddenly built on a foundation of maxed-out credit cards and hollow promises. He was trying to court investors for a new, high-risk real estate venture, his last chance to avoid a humiliating financial collapse. He projected an aura of casual success, but underneath, he was drowning. It was during a round of golf with 2 potential backers that the hearth became his obsession. "Forget the steakhouse, David," one of them said. "If you really want to impress us, get us a table at the hearth. My wife has been trying for a year. They say the chef is a total mystery, some kind of recluse." In that moment, David saw a lifeline. A reservation at the hearth was more than a meal. It was a nonverbal statement of power. It would prove he was still a man with connections, a player who could make the impossible happen. It would be a spectacle so dazzling it would blind the investors to the precarious state of his actual finances. And so, for two entirely different but equally desperate reasons, the DeLuca family became singularly focused on one goal. They had to get into the hearth. The profound, exquisite irony of the situation was completely lost on them. They were now begging for entry into a temple built to honor the very heritage they had spent years trying to erase from their own family. They were desperate for a taste of the authenticity they had so cruelly mocked. In the bustling, warm kitchen of the hearth, Elena was kept well apprised of their campaign. Her manager, a sharp and fiercely loyal woman named Maria, would give her the daily report. "Mrs. DeLuca's assistant called again today," Maria said one evening during prep, a wry smile on her face. She started by threatening to call the papers and ended by offering $5,000 in cash for a table. Any table. Elena paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt no giddy rush of triumph, only a cold, quiet satisfaction, like a general watching the enemy advance exactly as she had predicted. The bait, so carefully chosen and artfully presented, had been taken. They were hungry. They were desperate. They were moving from arrogance to supplication. They were being humbled, not by force, but by the undeniable allure of her success. She had made them crave the validation of the woman they believed they had broken. "The next time they call," Elena said to Maria, her voice calm and steady, "I want you to sound hesitant. Tell them you think there might be a last-minute cancellation for a VIP table next month. You're not sure, but it's a possibility. Tell them to keep the evening free, and that you'll call them if it becomes available." Maria's eyes widened slightly, understanding the genius of the final move. The trap was no longer about getting them in the door. It was about controlling their hope, making them wait by the phone, transforming their desperation into a feverish, agonizing anticipation. She would not just grant them a reservation, she would make them feel as though they were receiving an act of mercy. For 3 agonizing weeks, Isabella and David existed in a state of suspended animation, their lives revolving around the hope of a single phone call. Finally, it came. On a Wednesday afternoon, Isabella's phone buzzed with an unknown number. It was the reservationist from the hearth. Her voice was professional, almost apologetic. "Mrs. DeLuca," she said, "we've had a last-minute cancellation from a very important client for a prime table this Saturday evening. I thought of you immediately. Would you and your party still be interested?" Isabella's heart leaped, but she managed to keep her voice level, affecting an air of casual convenience. "Saturday? I believe we can make that work. Yes. Thank you for thinking of us." As soon as she hung up, a triumphant smile spread across her face. Victory. She immediately called David, who was equally ecstatic. They decided to invite Claire Vanderbilt, a move that served both their purposes. For Isabella, Claire was the perfect guest, a symbol of the sophisticated world she inhabited. For David, bringing his lover to the most exclusive table in the city would be the ultimate display of his, non-existent, power and influence. They prepared for the dinner as if preparing for a coronation, selecting their outfits with meticulous care, ready for their grand return to the center of the universe. When their black sedan pulled up to the old brick building, they were admittedly taken aback. The place was alive. A warm, golden light spilled from the large windows, along with a murmur of genuine laughter and conversation. This was not the hushed, sepulchral tomb of fine dining they were accustomed to. This was a place brimming with an energy that was both vibrant and deeply comforting. As they were led through the bustling room, Isabella tried to find fault, muttering, "How very boisterous," but the critique fell flat. The air smelled of roasting garlic, fresh bread, and something else she couldn't quite place. Joy. They were seated at the best table in the house, a curved booth in a semi-private alcove that offered a perfect view of the magnificent, roaring stone hearth. David felt a strange, unfamiliar pang of envy. The warmth, the life in the room, it was everything his own sterile mansion was not. Claire was simply enchanted, her eyes wide as she took in the rustic, yet profoundly elegant, space. Their server, a poised and graceful woman who introduced herself as Maria, treated them with an impeccable, formal politeness that was somehow more intimidating than fawning. It was the service of equals, and it subtly unsettled them. They ordered a frightfully expensive bottle of wine, and as they perused the menu, Maria returned. "Pardon the interruption," she said, her expression unreadable. "The chef has taken a personal interest in your table this evening and has asked me to make a recommendation. She strongly suggests her signature dish, the one that has become the soul of our restaurant, the cioppino." David, eager to experience the best of the best, immediately agreed. Isabella, not wanting to seem out of the loop, nodded her assent. "But of course," she said, as if she had been planning to order it all along, "one simply must have the signature dish." They had no memory of the name, no flicker of recognition. To them, it was just an order, a choice to be consumed. To Elena, watching them through a small, concealed window from her kitchen, it was the final move in a chess game that had been played for years. When the dishes arrived, they were breathtaking. This was not the humble, rustic stew they had once dismissed. This was its apotheosis. Served in a deep, handmade earthenware bowl, the broth was a burnished, velvety crimson. Perfectly seared scallops, plump mussels, and a magnificent king prawn were arranged like jewels in the center. The aroma of saffron, tomato, and the distant sea was intoxicating. For a moment, they were all silent. Then, they each took a spoonful. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. Claire Vanderbilt, the sophisticated critic, closed her eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated pleasure on her face. Isabella, who had been preparing her critique, found herself with nothing to say. The flavor was perfect, deep, complex, and utterly, undeniably delicious. But it was David's reaction that was the most dramatic. He tasted the broth, and all the color drained from his face. His carefully constructed composure crumbled. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. This is divine." He looked up, his eyes wide with a strange mix of awe and confusion. Isabella, regaining her footing, saw an opportunity to assert her dominance. "It is magnificent," she declared, her voice ringing with royal authority. "I simply must meet this chef and give her my compliments in person." "Maria," she commanded, "please ask the chef to come to our table." Maria gave a slight, knowing nod and disappeared toward the kitchen. A hush of anticipation fell over their table. They were about to meet the mysterious artist, the ghost in the forge. The swinging kitchen doors opened, and a figure emerged, silhouetted for a moment against the bright, chaotic light of the kitchen. The figure was tall and moved with a calm, deliberate grace that commanded attention. They were dressed in the pristine white uniform of a head chef, a crisp black apron tied at their waist. The figure stepped out of the silhouette and into the warm, fire-lit glow of the dining room. It was Elena. But it was an Elena they had never seen before. The hesitant, downcast woman who had flinched at their casual cruelty was gone forever. This woman stood tall, her shoulders back, her gaze as direct and as cold as a winter sea. Her face was serene, but her eyes held the quiet, unyielding power of a queen in her own court. The silence at the table was absolute, broken only by the clatter of David's spoon as it fell from his nerveless fingers onto his plate. His jaw hung open, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Claire looked from David's ashen face to Elena's icy composure, a dawning, sickening understanding spreading across her features. And Isabella looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her aristocratic mask shattered, revealing the raw, ugly shock beneath. All the blood drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed terror. Elena took 2 more steps, stopping directly beside their table. She looked down at the half-eaten bowl of cioppino, then met each of their gazes in turn. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, cutting through the stunned silence. "I'm so glad you enjoy it," she said, the barest hint of a smile on her lips. "It's an old family recipe." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, twisting like a knife. "I'm sure you remember it. The silence that followed Elena's devastating final words was more profound than any shouting match could ever have been. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of the DeLuca family. For a long, frozen moment, they could only stare, their faces a grotesque tableau of shock and horror. Claire Vanderbilt, ever the pragmatist, was the first to react. With a quiet scrape of her chair, she stood, picked up her clutch purse, and walked away from the table without a single backward glance. She was abandoning a sinking ship, and her departure was the first clear signal that the DeLuca dynasty was officially over. David remained frozen, his face ashen, looking at Elena as if she were an avenging angel risen from a life he thought he had successfully buried. It was Isabella, her face a mask of fractured composure, who finally broke. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She simply fumbled for her wrap, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, and fled from the table, from the restaurant, from the hundreds of curious eyes that now watched her every move. David followed a moment later, a broken man stumbling in his mother's wake. They didn't pay the bill. Maria simply let it sit on the table, a final, silent testament to their disgrace. Elena did not watch them go. She had already turned, her back to their pathetic retreat, and walked calmly back into the bright, orderly chaos of her kitchen. The public act of her revenge was complete. The rest was simply a matter of law. By noon the next day, the story of what became known as the DeLuca dinner had torn through their social circle like a wildfire. The narrative was too perfect, the irony too delicious. Isabella DeLuca, the self-proclaimed queen of taste, had been publicly humiliated by the very woman whose heritage she despised, using the very dish she had declared inedible. Beatrice Winthrop, her chief rival, held a special luncheon where the story was recounted with theatrical flair, each telling making Elena more heroic and the DeLucas more pathetic. Isabella's power had always been an illusion, built on fear and the collective agreement of her peers. With one meal, Elena had shattered that illusion. When Isabella tried to attend her weekly bridge game at the country club, she was met with a wall of polite smiles and sudden, awkward silences. No one would meet her eye. Beatrice delivered the killing blow, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Isabella, darling, you look positively ghastly," she cooed. "Was it something you ate?" The stifled laughter that followed was the sound of a social execution. Isabella was no longer a queen. She was a court jester, a cautionary tale. She was a pariah in the world she had once ruled. While the court of public opinion was delivering its verdict, a far more dangerous judgment was arriving at the DeLuca estate. At precisely 2 p.m., a professional process server, a man with cold, emotionless eyes, walked up the grand stone steps and rang the bell. David DeLuca, unshaven and still in a state of shock, answered the door. He was handed a thick, heavy stack of documents bound by a simple rubber band. It was the opening salvo of Elena's legal war, and it was a masterpiece of strategic destruction, orchestrated by the brilliant and merciless Evelyn Reed. It was not a simple petition for divorce. It was a comprehensive indictment. The first section was the divorce filing, citing irreconcilable differences. The second was a civil lawsuit for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Attached as exhibits was the mountain of irrefutable evidence Elena had so painstakingly collected, the digitized copies of every secret bank statement, a forensic accounting of every dollar wired from her trust, the credit card receipts for Claire's jewelry, the hotel bills, the airline tickets. Evelyn Reed had laid out David's 7-year campaign of deceit in such meticulous, undeniable detail that it left absolutely no room for negotiation or denial. The lawsuit demanded not only the return of every stolen cent, with interest, but also massive punitive damages for emotional distress and the deliberate destruction of Elena's financial security. But the most devastating part was the final document in the stack. It was a formal letter copied to the State Attorney General's office, outlining the clear evidence of felony financial crimes and strongly recommending the commencement of a criminal investigation. The threat was no longer just financial ruin, it was the cold, hard reality of a prison sentence. For David, it was the end of everything. The investors he had been courting had, of course, vanished. The news of his impending, scandalous divorce and potential criminal charges made him radioactive. He was trapped, a king with no money, no reputation, and no future, left with nothing but his disgraced mother in a cavernous mansion they could no longer afford to maintain. Claire, confirming his complete and utter isolation, sent him a single, final text message that evening. "Do not contact me again." Elena received the news in her small, quiet apartment overlooking the city. Evelyn Reed called to confirm that the papers had been served. "He didn't say a word," Evelyn reported, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "He just stood there and took them. The war is over, Mrs. DeLuca. All that's left is to negotiate the terms of their surrender." After she hung up, Elena walked to her window. She did not feel a rush of victorious joy or a thirst for more revenge. She felt quiet, a deep, profound sense of peace. Her justice had not been a single, fiery act of passion. It had been a slow, patient, and methodical campaign, fought and won on two fronts. In the court of public opinion, she had used her talent to dismantle their arrogance and social standing. And in a court of law, she had used their own greed and her meticulous planning to dismantle their future. She hadn't just escaped her past. She had reclaimed it, honored it, and used it to build a fortress. And from within its walls, she had watched the world she'd left behind simply and completely crumble into dust. The silence that followed Elena's devastating final words was more profound than any shouting match could ever have been. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of the DeLuca family. For a long, frozen moment, they could only stare, their faces a grotesque tableau of shock and horror. Claire Vanderbilt, ever the pragmatist, was the first to react. With a quiet scrape of her chair, she stood, picked up her clutch purse, and walked away from the table without a single backward glance. She was abandoning a sinking ship, and her departure was the first clear signal that the DeLuca dynasty was officially over. David remained frozen, his face ashen, looking at Elena as if she were an avenging angel risen from a life he thought he had successfully buried. It was Isabella, her face a mask of fractured composure, who finally broke. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She simply fumbled for her wrap, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, and fled from the table, from the restaurant, from the hundreds of curious eyes that now watched her every move. David followed a moment later, a broken man stumbling in his mother's wake. They didn't pay the bill. Maria simply let it sit on the table, a final silent testament to their disgrace. Elena did not watch them go. She had already turned, her back to their pathetic retreat, and walked calmly back into the bright, orderly chaos of her kitchen. The public act of her revenge was complete. The rest was simply a matter of law. By noon the next day, the story of what became known as the DeLuca dinner had torn through their social circle like a wildfire. The narrative was too perfect, the irony too delicious. Isabella DeLuca, the self-proclaimed queen of taste, had been publicly humiliated by the very woman whose heritage she despised, using the very dish she had declared inedible. Beatrice Winthrop, her chief rival, held a special luncheon where the story was recounted with theatrical flair, each telling making Elena more heroic and the DeLucas more pathetic. Isabella's power had always been an illusion, built on fear and the collective agreement of her peers. With one meal, Elena had shattered that illusion. When Isabella tried to attend her weekly bridge game at the country club, she was met with a wall of polite smiles and sudden, awkward silences. No one would meet her eye. Beatrice delivered the killing blow, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Isabella, darling, you look positively ghastly," she cooed. "Was it something you ate?" The stifled laughter that followed was the sound of a social execution. Isabella was no longer a queen. She was a court jester, a cautionary tale. She was a pariah in the world she had once ruled. While the court of public opinion was delivering its verdict, a far more dangerous judgment was arriving at the DeLuca estate. At precisely 2 p.m., a professional process server, a man with cold, emotionless eyes, walked up the grand stone steps and rang the bell. David DeLuca, unshaven and still in a state of shock, answered the door. He was handed a thick, heavy stack of documents, bound by a simple rubber band. It was the opening salvo of Elena's legal war, and it was a masterpiece of strategic destruction, orchestrated by the brilliant and merciless Evelyn Reed. It was not a simple petition for divorce. It was a comprehensive indictment. The first section was the divorce filing, citing irreconcilable differences. The second was a civil lawsuit for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Attached as exhibits was the mountain of irrefutable evidence Elena had so painstakingly collected: the digitized copies of every secret bank statement, a forensic accounting of every dollar wired from her trust, the credit card receipts for Claire's jewelry, the hotel bills, the airline tickets. Evelyn Reed had laid out David's 7-year campaign of deceit in such meticulous, undeniable detail that it left absolutely no room for negotiation or denial. The lawsuit demanded not only the return of every stolen cent, with interest, but also massive punitive damages for emotional distress and the deliberate destruction of Elena's financial security. But the most devastating part was the final document in the stack. It was a formal letter, copied to the State Attorney General's office, outlining the clear evidence of felony financial crimes and strongly recommending the commencement of a criminal investigation. The threat was no longer just financial ruin. It was the cold, hard reality of a prison sentence. For David, it was the end of everything. The investors he had been courting had, of course, vanished. The news of his impending, scandalous divorce and potential criminal charges made him radioactive. He was trapped, a king with no money, no reputation, and no future, left with nothing but his disgraced mother in a cavernous mansion they could no longer afford to maintain. Claire, confirming his complete and utter isolation, sent him a single, final text message that evening: "Do not contact me again." Elena received the news in her small, quiet apartment overlooking the city. Evelyn Reed called to confirm that the papers had been served. "He didn't say a word," Evelyn reported, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "He just stood there and took them. The war is over, Mrs. DeLuca. All that's left is to negotiate the terms of their surrender." After she hung up, Elena walked to her window. She did not feel a rush of victorious joy or a thirst for more revenge. She felt quiet, a deep, profound sense of peace. Her justice had not been a single, fiery act of passion. It had been a slow, patient, and methodical campaign, fought and won on 2 fronts. In the court of public opinion, she had used her talent to dismantle their arrogance and social standing. And in a court of law, she had used their own greed and her meticulous planning to dismantle their future. She hadn't just escaped her past. She had reclaimed it, honored it, and used it to build a fortress. And from within its walls, she had watched the world she'd left behind simply and completely crumble into dust. The months that followed the demolition of the DeLuca dynasty were quiet. For Elena, the silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was a clean, open space in which she could finally breathe. The legal proceedings concluded not with a dramatic courtroom battle, but with a quiet, unconditional surrender. Faced with an avalanche of irrefutable evidence, David and his mother had no choice but to agree to every one of Elena's terms. Her inheritance was returned, the damages were paid, and the great DeLuca estate was put up for sale to cover their debts. The news of David's potential criminal charges lingered, a dark cloud that would follow him for the rest of his life. But Elena found that she took no joy in their ruin. Her victory had not been about their destruction, but about her own reconstruction. She poured all of her energy, all of her focus, into the warm, living heart of her new world, the hearth. Her life found a new rhythm, one dictated not by social calendars and whispered insults, but by the seasons, by the delivery of fresh produce, by the daily ritual of baking bread. The hearth flourished, its reputation growing into a thing of legend. And then, one autumn afternoon, a year after that fateful dinner, an envelope arrived. It was from the Michelin Guide. With trembling hands, she opened it. The hearth had been awarded its first star. There was no grand celebration. Elena simply gathered her kitchen staff, the loyal, hard-working family she had built, and she cooked for them. They shared a simple meal of pasta and good wine, and their quiet, heartfelt congratulations were worth more to her than all the applause in the world. The ghosts of her past were finally gone. She was no longer haunted by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she had built. It was on a chilly afternoon the following week, during the lull before the evening service, that a ghost of a different kind walked through her door. An elderly man, dressed in a simple tweed coat that had seen better days, stepped quietly into the dining room. Elena, who was tasting a new sauce with her sous chef, looked up, ready to politely inform the man that they were not yet open. Then she froze. It was Richard DeLuca, David's father. Her first instinct was to build a wall, to brace herself for an appeal, a plea for mercy, a final, bitter accusation. He looked older, smaller than she remembered, the weight of his family's collapse etched into the lines on his face. He didn't approach her directly. Instead, he simply stood in the center of the room, looking around with a sad, wistful admiration. "It's even more beautiful than the pictures," he said, his voice soft and raspy. "You've built a wonderful place, Elena." He walked over to the table where she stood and sat down, a tired sigh escaping his lips. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began, not looking at her, but at the fire crackling in the great hearth. "My silence, all those years, it was not agreement. It was the cowardice of a man who loved peace more than he loved justice. I watched what my wife and son were doing to you, how they were chipping away at your spirit, and I did nothing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. "I couldn't stand up to them," he confessed, his voice thick with regret. "But I could not let them destroy you completely." Elena stared at the envelope, confused. "After you left," he continued, "I knew you were planning something, and I knew you would need resources. I called an old friend of mine, a lawyer, a very sharp woman named Evelyn Reed. I told her that if a certain client of hers needed a final push to secure a location for a new business, an anonymous investor would be willing to provide it." Elena's heart stopped. She looked from the envelope to his tired, guilt-ridden face, and the final, most unbelievable piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The angel investor. The lifeline that had come when she was at her breaking point. It was him. "I couldn't give you a voice in my own home, Elena," Richard said, a single tear tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek. "It is the great regret of my life. But I could give you the bricks and mortar to build your own." In that moment, Elena understood the difference between justice and healing. The lawsuit had been justice. It had balanced the scales. The Michelin star had been validation. It had proven her worth to the world. But this quiet confession, this secret act of faith from the most unexpected person in her life, this was grace. It was the act that finally, truly healed the wound. Her revenge had been a righteous fire, but Richard's quiet support had been the steady, hidden warmth that allowed it to catch. She looked at this broken, regretful man, a victim in his own way of the same tyranny that had oppressed her, and she felt not anger, not even pity, but a sense of profound, quiet closure. He had been an ally in the shadows all along. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. In that quiet, they are not just healing, they are sharpening the blade. And sometimes, an unexpected ally is waiting in the shadows, believing in the justice you are about to serve. Join us again for another story from GIA.ENHUS, where the deepest secrets are always served at the family table.